Ah, the Power Rangers, genuine cultural icons of their own little space. Pretty much everybody has at least some idea of what the general vibe of the Power Rangers is, but like, what do they actually do exactly? They battle evil, usually successfully, and they clearly have some kind of power, it's in the name, but what are those powers, and how do they work? The easy answer is just to assume that they have power because they do. After all, Power Rangers is a show with a primary audience of children, so how deep could it really go? The answer is pretty deep, actually. Thanks to just how many episodes of the show there are, and a lot of spin-off media targeted at older audiences who watched the show as kids, there are weirdly good explanations for how a lot of Power Ranger abilities actually function, and that's what I'm here today to talk about. So grab a drink, grab a snack, if you want to be really on theme, try to make them both the same primary color, and let's talk about what exactly makes these Rangers so powerful. Before I start really diving into this lore, I want to do a quick disclaimer as to where exactly I'm getting all this information. You might think the answer is just the Power Rangers TV show, and you would be super wrong about that. See, for the vast majority of Power Rangers history, they didn't really care about their lore that much. They would throw terms around, and sometimes those terms would be consistent, but when you're talking about consistency, sometimes doesn't mean much. Some of the later shows, especially Power Rangers Beast Morphers, really took these concepts and tried to rework them in a way that made sense, but most of this hard information is going to come from the Power Rangers comics. The comics really do all the heavy lifting when it comes to Power Rangers lore, so then why do I have to make this a disclaimer? Well, that's because the comics and the shows technically are not connected. They do not exist in the same world, and the stories of the two diverge quite a bit. Fortunately for these purposes, this video isn't really going to be about the storylines as much, it's going to be about the lore and mechanics of the power system. And I'm just gonna assume that the power system works basically the same in the comic and the show world. So then why am I bringing this up at all if I'm just going to treat them like they're the same? Well, this is for the people who have seen every episode of the show but haven't read the comics and are understandably baffled as to where I'm getting all this information. If you don't know where stuff is coming from, probably the comics, which are very good by the way, check them out. Okay, now on to the fun stuff. When we are talking about Power Ranger powers, which I will probably just refer to as Ranger powers for the rest of this video for convenience, all of them are going to come back to one concept: Morphin. And I did not pronounce it like that coincidentally, I did that on purpose because that is canonically how it is spelled. Morphing with a G on the end is of course one word, but for Power Ranger purposes, morphin without the G is a different word, used to refer to items, weapons, techniques, etc. that all relate to something called the Morphin Grid. The Morphin Grid is the most important concept we are going to go over today because it is the foundational establishing feature of the power system within Power Rangers. In fact, most questions that I'm going to ask could easily be answered with just me saying Morphin Grid. Where do the Rangers get their powers? The Morphin Grid. Where do the Rangers keep their weapons? Morphin Grid. Why can there only be one Ranger per color? Morphin Grid. We're going to come back to all these little nuances because it is a genuinely really cool system for a superhero universe. But let's start at the beginning. What is it? One of the simplest explanations that we've ever gotten for the Morphin Grid referred to it as a, quote, semi-sentient multidimensional energy field, which is a whole lot of information to unpack in that one tiny little chunk, so let me break it down bit by bit. Fact number one about the grid, it is not a place that you can go visit in physical space at least. It is another dimension of existence, like another layer of reality on top of ours. If you're familiar with the general concept of the astral plane, it's pretty similar to that. The Morphin Grid exists everywhere, or maybe it's more accurate to say that it's accessible from everywhere because it doesn't really follow the laws of physical space. And when I say everywhere, I mean at a multiversal level. There is only one Morphin Grid that stretches across the entire Power Rangers multiverse. They are not specific to each universe. Fact number two about the grid, it might possibly be alive or conscious in some capacity. This is what the term semi-sentient is referring to in that original description, but that's also not really expanded on. We've seen a few cases where the grid seems to have some level of inherent morality, but there are also cases that we'll touch on later of sentient beings fusing with the energy that makes up the grid. So like maybe it's kind of just absorbed consciousness from them. I don't know. And like I said, hasn't really been expanded upon. The only reason I put that as fact number two and not fact number three is that fact number three is going to be a much better transition to the next part of the video. So, fact number 3, the most important one. The Morphin Grid is full of energy, an insane, actually possibly infinite amount of energy coursing through all of it. Now, infinite energy is a very weird thing when you're talking about physics, but the Morphin Grid is sci-fi and also pseudo-magic, so it can exist in a stable form within itself. However, with the right techniques and resources, people can create a kind of small access channel into the grid and bring some of its infinite energy supply to the physical realm. At a foundation, this is what every Power Ranger Morpher is. They're like keyholes into an energy dimension that power up whoever uses them. The actual range of abilities that you can get from this is way more varied than you might think, but I'm trying to go in some level of chronological order here, so before we break down what powers the Rangers actually have, let's talk about how Morphers work. This might sound like it's going to be a whole complicated explanation, but it's really not because of how weirdly easy it is to access the grid. There's not one set way to do it. Pretty much any method can work as long as that method allows you to harness a large amount of energy. The most common way this is done is through technology. Most morphers are basically little machines that poke a hole in the barrier between dimensions, access the Morphin Grid, and then contain within them some sort of, for lack of a better term, valve mechanism, I guess, that can open and close that, allowing the energy to flow through when needed. Some technology to achieve this purpose has arisen in so many different forms. There are a ton of independent organizations with Morphin Grid access. The US government has Morphin Grid access. In fact, most notably, there's a group called Grid Battle Force, which figured out a way to condense the Morphin Grid into a liquid form called MorphX. How exactly they were able to generate MorphX was never fully explained, which does kind of make sense, I guess. It would just be a lot of science mumbo jumbo. But yeah, they turned grid energy into a liquid form, which was an infinite, free, clean energy source. It had a catch, of course, but that would be skipping way ahead in this explanation, so for now, just remember there was a catch. But say you're not technologically inclined and you don't want to use any of these methods to access the grid. There are other ways, primarily magic. Yes, magic absolutely exists within the Power Rangers universe, which maybe shouldn't be a surprise because Mystic Force exists, but regardless, it's never really been explained in that much detail. However, there is enough that I can give you some theories as to how it might work. While magical spells and artifacts can be used to access the Morphin Grid, it doesn't seem like magic exists because of the grid. It's just a natural phenomenon that also exists parallel. I call it a natural phenomenon because most Power Ranger magic appears to relate to the natural world in one way or another. For example, the Mystic Force Rangers primarily use elemental magic, whereas the Jungle Fury Rangers connect with animal spirits. There's also a lot of demonic magic in the Power Rangers world, like a weird amount, more than you would expect, and it is straight up referred to sometimes as demonic in nature. The presence of this is one of the main reasons why I don't think that magic is directly connected to the Morphin Grid, because the demon villains don't really use grid stuff. They're just also around and are connected to death and hell, as you would think. So we know that the primary two ways to access the grid are through the right kind of tech or the right kind of spells. But if you don't have the know-how to figure out either of those, you can get lucky and stumble upon a grid access point that someone else made, which is usually going to be an alien. After all, the grid is not just an Earth thing or just a human thing. It exists everywhere, and so there are Power Rangers everywhere on a whole bunch of different planets. Actually, the first people to ever access the grid were aliens. This was a group now known as the Morphin Masters. They have their own whole history that I won't go into here for time, but the important part for this is that they made so many grid access points, just like a whole bunch of them, and then shot a lot of them out into space. Several of the items that Rangers used to power up came from the Masters in one form or another. They made the Dino Gems from Dino Thunder, the Ener Gems from Dino Charge, and most importantly for our purposes, the Ninja Nexus Prism from Ninja Steel. The Ninja Nexus Prism is the most important for us because we actually know why they made it, and they made it as a mobile ranger factory, which is sentient enough to fly to planets that it knows are about to be in danger and power up a ranger team right there before flying off and going to the next danger zone. And before some people ask, no, Ninjor from the original series does not appear to be affiliated with the Morphin Masters. He created the power coins that gave the original team their abilities, but he did that independently. Weirdly, Ninjor's history has never really been explored much in the last 30-something years, but best I can tell, he's just a different guy who also knew how to do that, which kind of proves my point about how weirdly easy Morphin Grid access is to acquire. So now we know what the grid is and at least roughly how you can access it. But since I'm trying to do this kind of chronologically as to how someone would acquire ranger powers, there's one more thing I have to cover before we actually talk about what those powers are. Fortunately, this is probably one of the biggest questions that people have going into this video. Why are colors a big part of it? Even if you don't know a thing about Power Rangers, you know they got colors. That's like the first thing that people notice about the Power Rangers. They are the superhero teams where all of them are a different color. And weirdly, there's a very in-depth lore explanation for all of that. It is so detailed and well explained that I'm gonna have to pull up a couple custom charts and diagrams that I made just for this. So for those of you out there who really like the deep lore, buckle in, you are going to love this next segment. The first question to answer here is maybe the question that I get asked the most in regards to Power Rangers stuff. How are the colors assigned? What determine who gets which color? What powers do the different colors have? What do the colors mean? And the answer is, absolutely nothing. The colors have no in-universe meaning at all. Now, I know some of you are looking at your screen really weird right now because you watched this show when you were a kid and you distinctly remember that there was definitely significance to the colors. There are a few exceptions to that rule, and I'll go over them in a minute, but let's start with the baseline. Though the baseline isn't really anything that I have a lot to talk about because the baseline is, again, nothing. The colors do not relate to who is wearing the suit whatsoever. They're not meaningless, they have a purpose, but it is not related to the Rangers themselves. Before we get to what that purpose is, let's hit the exceptions really quick. There are 3 of them, but only 2 of them are actual in-universe things. One of them is more on the production side. The production reason is the most boring, so we'll get that one out of the way first. Basically, a lot of Power Rangers writers like to mimic the character archetypes found in the original Mighty Morphin show, so Blue Rangers are often the smart one of the team, Black Rangers are often the cool one, Pink Rangers are girl, but there's not an in-universe rule for this, it's just something that the writers do. The first of the lore exceptions isn't even really an exception because it goes back to magic stuff. Remember how I said that a lot of Power Ranger magic is natural or elemental? Yeah, if a Ranger is using elemental magic, they'll have the color most typically associated with that element. So, you know, Rangers who use fire magic are typically going to be red, water magic is blue, light magic becomes gold, things like that. But that is probably more of a function of the magic rather than a function of the grid itself, which is why I say it's only kind of an exception. The final and most solid exception to the color meanings is simply uniform conventions, as weird as that sounds. We see this most prominently in Power Rangers SPD, where the color of the Ranger is actively connected to their rank. Colors are basically just like badges for these teams, and in fact, SPD is one of the very few shows where we see main Rangers actively change colors. The original SPD Red Ranger, Jack, actually retires partway through the show, leading to the Blue Ranger, Sky, taking over his position and becoming the Red Ranger, and he just has that suit for the rest of it, ending at that status quo. The previous Green Ranger, Bridge, then levels up to Blue, and the other 2 don't change, but still, you can kind of see how the rank progression works. The important thing to note about this is that there doesn't seem to be any power or mechanic-based reason for the color switch. It's just a uniform policy of Space Patrol Delta as an organization that has to manage a lot of different Ranger teams. There's no grid connection, it's just a thing that they do. And yes, this does mean that Red Rangers are not always cosmically designated as the team leader. There are Power Ranger teams not led by Red Rangers. It does happen, and the only reason that I can give you for why Reds are such a high percentage of leaders is either just convention again, or the thing about the writers mimicking the old archetypes. So, now that we've established all that, let's get into the complicated stuff. At the beginning of this section, I promised charts and deep dives, and then I immediately said, but none of this stuff actually matters. Hoo-hoo, that's gonna change now. This is where things get cool. At this point, some of you might be asking a very valid question. If there's apparently no connection between the color of the suit and the person wearing it, then why is there obviously a rule about not having multiple of the same color on the same team? The answer to that is safety reasons, of all things. To talk about this, we need to discuss the spatial structure of the Morphin grid itself. I'm going to represent this with 2 models. First, one that's a lot more simple, but a little bit less accurate, just so we can get the easy information out of the way. Then I'm going to give you a more accurate one that's a little bit more complex once we have a foundation. Now, I'm about to show you the first diagram of how the Morphin grid can be represented. Anyone want to take a shot as to what that's going to look like? It's not a difficult question. Did you answer grid? Yeah, the Morphin grid is a grid. Shocking. The x-axis of this grid is going to be the type of morpher that we are dealing with. Every morpher accesses the grid in a little bit of a different way, be that magical, technological, whatever, and that sends the coordinates to a different point within the grid. And of course, remember that the vast majority of the time, most rangers on a single team are going to be using the same type of morpher, so you can kind of think of each column within this graph as a different team. Then, as some of you have probably already guessed, the y-axis is color. The Morphin grid is, after all, just energy, and apparently some of that energy expresses itself as visible light, which is how different points can be identified. So it can be thought of like this. Each different morpher that you have can be used to access a different slice of that grid, and within that slice, you can calibrate the morpher to acquire a different color. This will send you to that specific point on this grid. So, say that you are the Mystic Force Yellow Ranger. That means your morpher is specifically set to send you to this point on the grid, and this region is where you are drawing the energy from. Meanwhile, if you're the Wild Force Red Ranger or whatever, you're going to this point on the grid. These points, though, are not exclusive. You can have multiple morphers drawing from the same square of this grid. That does work. We've seen it happen in the show, but doing so is incredibly dangerous. Ultimately, every morpher, no matter how small, is a wild little device capable of literally ripping holes between dimensions, and if you have two of these portals ripped open too close to each other, then they start pulling the energy in two directions at once, splitting the flow and making it very unstable. This can be done for short periods of time with no ill side effects, but if you do this for too long, best case scenario, your morpher doesn't get enough energy and stops working properly. Worst case scenario, it overloads and you die. So that's what the colors are for. They are basically just coordinate indicators, ensuring that every member of a team gets enough power and doesn't intrude upon the power areas of their teammates. And honestly, I really like that. I think that's 10 times more unique and interesting than something about personality. Like, that's a really cool power system, right? But wait, I hear you yelling at me through the screen. Calm down. What about the times when there are two rangers of the same color on the same team? Because that does happen, so how does that work? Well, that is where the other grid model comes in. I showed you the very simple one with the nice X and Y lines going across the whole thing first, and that is not inaccurate, but to be more accurate, the grid does not have those and is much more of a spectrum than neat little boxes, so it should look something like this. The function of this graph is still the same at the base. The x-axis is still the morpher, the y-axis is still the color, and those coordinates give you your power section on the Morphin grid. But rather than getting your own little square that is yours and no one else's, each point kind of creates a safe zone around it. Let's return to our earlier example. Say you are Mystic Force Yellow. You turn your morpher on, this little coordinate activates, and kind of creates a bubble around it that is your energy zone. If off in another part of the world, Wild Force Red activates their morpher, their coordinate's gonna pop up and their bubble appears, but your bubble and their bubble are very far apart from each other, so it's fine. Now let's say that a villain has duplicated a Mystic Force morpher and used it to turn themselves into Mystic Force Light Orange or whatever. Even though that's not exactly the same as Mystic Force Yellow and technically is a different point on the grid, if it's close enough, those safe zone bubbles are going to overlap. This means that you are splitting energy in this region, and that is dangerous. Theoretically, this also means that the closer two rangers are in color, the more dangerous that becomes. Now, I've drawn the size of these safe zones kind of arbitrarily because I actually have no idea how big they would be. In fact, it might even vary by team, but let's take a look at Power Rangers Dino Charge, which notably has a blue and an aqua ranger on the same morpher. They're both blue in some form or another, but they are clearly different shades of blue, and that means that however big the Dino Charge safe zones are, the blue and aqua ones don't overlap, allowing these two morphers to be used together safely. This also provides an explanation for why rangers of the same color across different teams have very different shades of that color. For example, if I throw a picture of Mystic Force Blue up on the screen, you will see that despite being just called a Blue Ranger, she aligns a lot more with Aqua than the Dino Charge Blue, and that's because she is a Blue Ranger, but she's just drawing from that range of the spectrum on her column. Does this mean that there could then be a Mystic Force Navy Blue Ranger or something like that? Possibly, though like I said, I don't know if the safe zone bubbles are the same size for different teams. Maybe because Mystic Force uses magic, their zones are larger and therefore there can be less of them. This whole diagram system also provides an explanation for a classic line from the original series, that being, too much pink energy is dangerous. It is true, too much pink energy is dangerous, it's just not exclusive to pink. Too much of any color energy channeled through the same form is dangerous. Zordon was just specifically referring to pink energy in that case. Huge props to the writers who came up with this whole thing, because I absolutely love it. The color system is my favorite thing to explain to people when it comes to Power Rangers lore, because no one expects it to go as deep as it does. It's very easy to accept, oh yeah, they're all different colors because they are, but then when you hear the reasoning behind it, my god, it's really cool world building. Oh, and just to address two little pedantic things that I know people are going to bring up if I don't hit them now. One, how are there two identically shaded Red Rangers in Power Rangers Time Force? That's easy. The Quantum Ranger is using a distinctly different type of Morpher, so it accesses it at a different point along the X-axis. And then, how does this work with Power Rangers Super Megaforce, given their ability to transform into other Rangers? As for that, I really don't know. Nothing in Megaforce is ever explained at all. My best guess is that these transformations are temporary, and so they're just kind of taking a risk whenever they do it. Megaforce, it's kind of a nightmare from a lore perspective. As much as I can, I try to pretend that it does not exist. One final question in this section before I move on to talk about specific Ranger abilities, that being, can someone wield multiple Morphers at the same time? And yeah, you absolutely can. It just has high odds of overloading and killing you. You're tearing open a bunch of interdimensional portals in close proximity to you, and you're trying to take on all of that energy yourself. It is not a safe thing to do. That said, it is the primary plot of the villain Lord Draken, who is the main antagonist of several Power Rangers comic arcs. He succeeds in doing this, actually, and is able to draw enough Morphin Grid energy that he can enter the grid itself and then use that to become God. That's a whole other thing. But yes, you can do it. It's just very, very, very risky and not recommended. So, now we have established what the grid is, how you can access it, and why the colors are very, very important for everyone's well-being. Now let's talk about why you would want to go through with all this. What abilities does Morphin Grid access provide? But first, a very quick disclaimer. I know there's been a few of those in this video, but like I said right at the beginning, Power Rangers didn't really care that much about making their lore consistent for several decades, so this is just the way it's gotta be. The things that I'm about to describe are general Ranger powers, not the ones that are specific or iconic to a given team, the grid-connected ones that in theory every Ranger team could use, but this doesn't mean that they all use all of them. This is especially going to apply when I start talking about Ranger tech and arsenals, because the grid can do some very cool stuff related to that, but not every Ranger team seems to use these kind of options. And you know what? This actually does make a lot of sense from a world building perspective because of the fact that every Morpher functions differently, but we also don't have a comprehensive description of how every Morpher works, so I can't tell you the specifics for each team. So think of everything that I say in this section as kind of an archetype of what Ranger powers are, but also, since this was written after years of very shaky lore, understand that every different team is going to put their own spin on it and do things a little differently. We'll start off with the easiest Ranger powers and build up to the most complex ones. The most simple of all the abilities is, well, you're getting interdimensional energy pumped into your body directly, and that makes you a lot better at fighting. When you are morphed, the energy that is flowing from the Morpher into your body gives you super strength. Not like Hulk level or anything, but maybe Captain America or even a little bit above. The grid energy also increases your durability by projecting a small force field around your body. In fact, this is often taken as the canon reason why sparks fly out whenever the Rangers are hit. That is the force field releasing energy to counter the blow. And of course, the grid energy is not just some vague magical force that only powers up living things. It is an energy source and can be used like any normal energy source. Zords, weapons, really any technology that the Rangers might be using doesn't run on batteries, it runs on grid energy directly. All of this stuff is cool, but not necessarily the most unique. You have an infinite field of energy, so obviously you're going to use that to power things. Where stuff starts to get very interesting, though, is when we stop taking things out of the Morphin Grid and start putting things in. The only thing that you'll find natively in the Morphin Grid is energy, but the keyword there is natively. The grid can sustain physical matter, and that opens up a lot of options. Suits, vehicles, weapons, all of that stuff can be sent into the grid and kept there so that the Rangers can use their Morphers to put in specific coordinates and summon it whenever needed, just like calling up a file on a computer. In fact, in some cases, Ranger tech isn't even something originally from the physical world. It is grid energy programmed into a construct form that then can be summoned to the physical world in the same manner. This is also probably how some Ranger teleportation works, taking the Ranger's body, putting it into the grid, and then spitting it out somewhere else, though there is a little asterisk on that because teleportation is incredibly common in this world. Almost every Ranger team and villain group uses teleportation in one way or another, and a lot of those villain groups especially are not connected to the grid, so teleportation tech also does exist in other forms that are not explained, and maybe some of the Rangers use that, I don't know. While we're on the topic of people going into the grid though, if you're curious what it looks like in there, it has been shown, but in several different ways, and the variation has never actually been explained. My personal theory, which is obviously a headcanon, but I think a very good one, is that since the grid is basically magic in some form, it's one of those tropes where it appears differently to different people in ways that they can understand, so that's why it just looks different in all these different shots. And with all that considered, there is one more major ability that is part of the standard Ranger power kit, one that you could easily just write off as a trope of the genre and not really think about too hard, but no, there's lore for this. How do all the Rangers know how to fight? Of course, it comes back to the Morphin grid, because all of this does. The grid can store energy, stores a lot of energy, it can store physical matter, and it can also store information. Over the many, many years of people accessing the grid to create Rangers that battle evil and protect people, the grid has slowly amassed a database for fighting techniques, which gets automatically downloaded into the brains of Rangers that access it. This is not an instantaneous masterclass in every fighting technique. You still have to train with it because getting it all downloaded into your brain with no context isn't entirely helpful on its own, but it certainly gives people a head start. If you think that this also sounds a little bit risky to use, I mean, yeah, you're not wrong. The grid being able to download, store, and upload information to minds and consciousness does have negative effects from time to time. This is where the semi-sentient comment that I mentioned a long time ago at this point starts to come into play. The grid has been infected with evil from time to time, and this is implied to be very, very bad if it was ever able to spread fully. Rangers who have accessed parts of the grid that have been infected have become evil themselves because that evil brain pattern goes onto them as well, and if the grid was ever completely infected, it would destroy the universe somehow. This is also, of course, never fully explained, and if you take it at exact face value based on the lines that were said, it heavily implies that the presence of enough evil in the grid would just destroy the grid. Then this subsequently would destroy the universe because the grid is a fundamental part of that universe and the balance of everything energy-wise would be thrown off. My personal theory that I think makes a little bit more sense is that if the sentience of the grid was fully turned evil, then it would use its energy to wipe out the rest of the universe because it was fully evil and wanted to see more destruction. All this raises another point though. Can evil really be conveyed as simple information like the movements for a fighting technique could? This is a very philosophical question, and fortunately, we don't have to dive into the philosophy of it because basic information is not the only type that the grid can store. It can store full entities. If you connect to the Morphin grid enough, though we don't know what exactly the threshold for that enough is, your consciousness will become entangled with it. And then when you die, rather than going wherever it normally would, I guess, your consciousness becomes a part of the Morphin grid instead. This is where Zordon is right now. I've said it too many times in this section especially, but this is also something that was just never really explained fully. It happened at the end of Power Rangers Cosmic Fury. Zordon just shows up in the Morphin grid as like a weird ghost or something. And then Cosmic Fury ended, and it was the end of the main show continuity, so we never got more information on that, which was an insane choice that the writers made. However this actually worked. Zordon is a pretty safe choice to have his consciousness contained within the grid, but unfortunately for the universe, this rule does not only apply to good guys. Bad guys can be uploaded to the grid too. The most important example of this is the main villain from Power Rangers RPM, a sentient computer virus named Venjix. While Venjix was defeated in the show, one of the last shots of RPM shows that he uploaded himself to one of the Rangers' Morphers in the final battle, and since that Morpher was no longer used, he was contained, but technically not destroyed. Then, in Power Rangers Beast Morphers years later, an organization called Grid Battle Force got a hold of that Morpher and did some experiments on it, which released Venjix back into their networks. With his mind uploaded to the grid directly, Venjix was able to access so much more power and evolved into a new, stronger form named Evox, who was in turn the main villain of that series. And if the name Grid Battle Force rang a bell, yeah, they were the organization who made MorphX, which was that liquid form of Morphin Grid that was supposedly clean energy. The reason they stopped doing that was there was an evil computer virus that had infected their whole supply, and they figured if that could happen once, it could happen again, so they stopped using it. Which means that yes, in very true fashion for the show, the negative byproduct of their clean energy was evil. Just direct, straight up evil, which is the most Power Rangers crap I've ever heard. And that brings me around very nicely to the last point I want to make in this video, which is that despite the fact I've been saying Ranger powers this whole time, access to the Morphin Grid is not exclusive to Rangers. The grid does not magically designate the people who use its energy as Power Rangers. In fact, it's kind of the other way around. Power Ranger is just a term for a hero that uses the energy of the Morphin Grid to protect people. Actually, by the information presented purely in the show at least, I don't think we know where the term Power Ranger originated. The first time that it ever came to Earth was with Zordon. Zordon then powered up the first team that we see, and all the Power Ranger shows exist in the same universe. Well, most of them at least, there is some multiverse stuff, but the teams that came after just knew who the old ones were and used the same name. There are heroes with grid-based powers who don't call themselves Rangers. There are villains who access the grid either to gain power for themselves or disrupt the abilities of the Rangers they're fighting. And even animals have gotten grid-based powers on like one specific occasion, though the animal did later become a Ranger anyway. Yes, there is at least one animal Power Ranger. But ultimately, no matter who they are or where they are or what their motivation is, everyone who accesses the Morphin Grid is accessing the same grid, and the power is protecting them all, as long as they're not too close in coordinates to anyone else. Then they might explode. And now, right at the end of the video, I do have a question for you guys to answer in the comments, especially if you weren't super familiar with Power Rangers before this video. Was this lore more or less complicated than you expected it to be? For my part, I remember that when I first learned this, it really caught me off guard how in-depth the world building was. I mean, who would have guessed that the funky color-coded superheroes get their abilities from basically a coordinate-based interdimensional supercomputer made of sentient energy? And you know who definitely wouldn't have guessed it? Power Rangers themselves for about 20 to 25 years. So huge shout out to the writers of the later shows especially, and the comics for giving us all of this lore to work with. And with that, that is the end of today's video. As always, thank you so much to Ruben Perez for drawing the art of the avatar that you've been watching talk at you for the last half hour or so. And hey, there were actually a couple of new poses in this one. Look at me slowly improving things bit by bit on this channel. Thank you all so much for watching as well. I do really hope you enjoyed, and may the power protect you all.